Welcome to Tales from the Trenches Tuesdays. Today, I am absolutely honored to have my good friend and fundraising colleague, Jason Lewis, on board. For those of you who don't know Jason, he's the founder of Responsive Fundraising, a professional learning community committed to changing what it needs to increase fundraising capacity in today's nonprofit sector. He strives to ensure that leaders understand and experience a holistic approach that is meaningful for those on both sides of the gift exchange. Jason is the publisher of Carefully and Critically Responsive's quarterly professional journal. In addition to all that, where I first learned about Jason was from the book, The War for Fundraising Talent, which is actually one of my little go-to books. I've probably given out dozens of them to fundraising colleagues, and I think it's just a great tool for folks to have. Actually, I was fortunate enough to be at one of Jason's in-person seminars back in 2019, and Jason actually took some little excerpts from his book and have these little cards. And I think even on here, I wrote a whole bunch of notes on it. So you can kind of see Jason is kind of like the founder of those 3-lane approach to fundraising, which we'll get to in a little bit. But I just really wanted to welcome Jason. You talk about the messy middle is we both have adolescent kids, right? So they're kind of right in the adolescence, and that's about as messy as you can possibly get. But fundraising as a profession is kind of undergoing a bit of a renaissance. And it's a relatively young profession, especially here up in Canada. So tell me how fundraising, or as you see fundraising, is going to change kind of in the next 3 to 5 years, but then even more so in a generation from now.
Yeah, so I think when I talk about the messy adolescence, I'm talking about if you sort of imagine the fundraising profession, if you will, or the fundraising community, all of us collectively sharing the same story. So it's not this individual Jack's story versus Jason's story, but it's sort of this collectively shared social imaginary, right? And if you think about it through the lens of sort of human development, you got this sort of phase. It's like your teenager that we were talking about before we hit the record button. He's going off to high school. He's in his messy adolescence, and he's saying things to dad that are sort of messy and quirky. I mean, I've got a house full of teenagers here too. And at each different sort of point in that sort of phase of adolescence, you sort of pick up on things. And one of the things that I don't think that the fundraising community has learned how to do, and this gets back to what we were just talking about with the 2 lanes. We have learned how to become what I call master technicians of lane 1. It's highly technical expertise. It's all highly complicated, and it's largely based on 20th century sort of industrialism, mass market, consumerism. It's everything that we sort of know and understand about the 20th century. The entire 20th century, from the back end of the Industrial Revolution to the sort of the rise of the consumer society to today. And but we're transitioning now, first couple of decades into the 21st century, we're transitioning into what Margaret Heffernan, she's an favorite author of mine, she talks about how we're moving from a complicated world to a complex world. And the 2 words are oftentimes used interchangeably, but they mean very different things. The engine under the hood of my minivan outside is a complicated machine. The relationship that you and I have with a myriad of donors and a myriad of colleagues is a complex living system. That's complex. We can fix the individual parts in my engine in my minivan. The individual parts can usually be fixed in isolation. In a complex system like we're talking about, which is what that lane 2 plays out, and what I'm talking about with the messy adolescence, is that oftentimes it's the relationships between the parts, not the parts themselves. So this is I'm trying to get really quickly to sort of what what you're interested in hearing me talk about. Fundraising, to grow up, is going to have to start focusing on the relationships and not the individual isolated parts. We've been focusing on the fundraisers. We've been focusing on the donors. We've been focusing, I talk a lot about getting the boards and the bosses right. Those are all individual parts. They're all that, and that's a very 20th century sort of enlightened view, very reductionist sort of view. What we're not paying attention to is that it's the interactions, the relationships that happen. Working that out is what it means to be in relationship. Right. That's the growing up I'm talking about. That fundraisers don't often show up on the job in a way where they feel integrated, for example. They feel like what I call this intervening subculture. They're sort of given, regardless of how big or small the operation is, the fundraiser doesn't feel integrated. Well, if the fundraiser doesn't feel integrated, Jack, the donor's not going to feel very integrated either. And so you create this, fundraising starts to operate like this subculture, and it starts to operate like it's almost like it's a commercial enterprise, as one researcher friend of mine refers to it. She calls it the instrumental view. Fundraising sort of takes on this instrumental, like a machine, like a commercial enterprise, like a for-profit venture. Either we or someone else has sort of projected all these assumptions about how this is supposed to work on ourselves, basically from the mark, from the as if you and I as fundraisers operate like a sales guy, like I did when I was in college selling appliances at Sears or something.
Well, and that's an interesting point, Jason. To sell a widget, I've often compared fundraising to sales, to show how it's not like sales, right? So, you go to a car, the question, you need a new car. So is it going to be blue? Is it going to be red? Is it going to be Ford, or is it going to be electric? All this. And so it becomes very academic. But when you deal with fundraising, other than the folks that tithe, no one has to give to charity. It's a choice. Your car breaks down. You need a new car. You don't have to give to charity. And why would you give to charity A over charity B is a whole other set of complications. And, people try to kind of boil it down to formulas and, the way it works. And there's no recipe for creating a relationship, right? It's a human interaction. You can read as much as you want about creating and how to foster relationships, but I found that either you have the skill set about you're a relationship person or you don't. It's not something that can be taught, whereas mass marketing or direct mail, right, there's volumes of books on that, on how to do it and how to do it effectively. And we've done it as an institution, or an industry rather, fairly well, right? We have that puppy fairly well skinned. But to try to go to the next one is to how to become a decent person and have relationships with folks. That's much harder to do.
Well, but what you're getting at is the difference between, I got in a lot of trouble. You and I, Jack, are really we're good at saying you get on these formats like this and you end up saying things that hurt people's feelings, I think. So I said something on a podcast conversation, I don't know, about 6 or 9 months ago, I said something to the extent that like 4 out of 5 of the fundraisers that are probably out there applying for jobs don't want to have a conversation with the donor for a myriad of reasons. And I got in a lot of trouble for that. But I still sort of stand by that there's a large majority of our fundraisers that are what I would call lane one fundraisers, stuck in what I call arm's length fundraising, stuck in that lane one. And their professional identity, who they are as a professional, is very much wrapped up in everything that can be accomplished in lane one. And when you transition into that messy middle, the whole story starts to change. It's not all this broadcast communication. It's two-way back and forth communication instead of one-way broadcasting. And I, as most of my listeners on my podcast hear me, the lunch table is, in my mind, sort of the metaphorical sort of example. It's the essence of what happens there. And the lunch table's not predictable. You don't know if they're going to show up with their checkbook. You don't know if anybody's going to come with them. You don't know if you're going to goober it up. You don't know what the waitress is going to do. That ultimately hinges on conversation. It hinges on your ability to show up on time, have a meaningful conversation, and not insist that you leave with an outcome necessarily. And that's why we call it the messy middle. Think about it for a minute. How many of our consultancies, this is my big critique on the sort of the consultancy, sort of the expertise space in our domain. We've got experts that just master to the moon and back on lane one, and we've got more than our share of shops that know how to do what you and I understand to be lane three, all these large sort of, but nobody sort of is majoring on the fact that, hey, there's this connection point here. There's this point that sort of brings it all together. And the reason you don't have a lot of experts running around talking about that is because it doesn't deliver on predictable, highly metric, doesn't deliver on the things that the other two lanes can. And so what happens is when your experts are sort of driving the story, when your experts are sort of have the privilege of the front of the room and they're not talking about something, whatever they're not talking about doesn't become part of the professional story. It doesn't become part of the story.
Well, Jason, thank you so very much for being my inaugural guest on the Tales from the Trenches Tuesdays. I couldn't think of anyone else that I would rather have as my first guest. You and I have known each other, I think it's 3 or 4 years now. And I count you as one of my good confidants when it comes to fundraising, and you're a great guy to just bounce ideas off of. So if folks wanted to get hold of you, how would they do that?
Yeah, so thank you, Jack. I do consider you a friend as well. Certainly more than just a professional colleague. And I look forward to the opportunities that we have to be together in person when those opportunities arise. Best place to find me and to find my consulting team is at responsivefundraising.com. Again, that's www.responsivefundraising.com. I'm sure you can put that in the show notes. And then my email address is just very simple. Is just simply put the word Jason in front of that. Jason at responsivefundraising.com. It's the easiest way to find me. Most people, Jack, find me on LinkedIn. I'm a pretty popular voice on LinkedIn. I've got a lot of. I'm usually posting at least every other day. Got a lot of people counting on me to post something snarky or smart or opinionated. And I
think it's thought-provoking.
Yeah, that's what it is. That's what it is. Yeah.
Right? And I love reading your stuff because you and I kind of sing from the same hymnal. So, if nothing else, it just kind of affirms my beliefs. And that I'm not, because sometimes as a fundraiser, you think that you're alone on an island somewhere. And no one really understands you, and you're just some beast that they kind of throw meat at every now and then. But when I hear folks like you, and we're kind of singing from the same hymnal, I'm like, oh, okay, so I'm not totally off my rocker. It's helpful. So thank you very much for doing that.
Hey, Jack, it's been a pleasure.
Likewise.
Hi, folks. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button right here.